afternoon from wherever you are on the world. And today's topic is very topical in terms of where we are looking at from the IT industry and where overall the industry is going and where various businesses around the world are looking at from when it comes to cost reduction, when it comes to better performance, better availability, those kind of parameters. So the topic for today I'm going to be talking about is around cloud security and focusing mainly on some of the challenges within that environment, within the cloud environment, specifically around security, looking at threats, looking at key risks, and ending the presentation with some recommendations that I feel will be critical for anyone working on cloud security. So before we kickstart, just a quick introduction about myself. So I'm Dhananjaya Naronikar, and I'm currently based out of Australia in Melbourne, and I'm the head of cybersecurity and privacy for an organization called SXiQ, and we are mainly a cloud organization. So when I say cloud, we are partners with quite a few cloud providers, and along with that we are integrators as well. So we work closely with a lot of end users who use cloud, and we internally use cloud ourselves. And we also have other areas that we focus on, specifically on digital transformation, which again is cloud-based. So there's a lot about cloud, where I'm involved from a day-to-day basis. And other than that, I'm also president and chair for SXiQ Melbourne Chapter, where we have close to 650 plus members. And I also sit on the global advisory board for the CTIA program, which is run by EC Council, and that's a certification program in threat intelligence. So that's a bit of brief about myself, where I come from, and my experience. Moving on, just a quick focus on what I will be looking at as an agenda or key topics that I'll be touching on. One, looking at where we are as an industry globally on cloud, and what does cloud actually mean, and what is the high-level reference model? When we say cloud, what is the structure of a cloud? And other than that, I'll be delving a bit deeper into the key areas on cloud security and challenges, security threats, and the kind of mitigation that we could be looking at in the cloud environment, some of common attack types in the cloud environment that we've been seeing globally. And then I'll quickly move on to what are our current on-premise security controls that we focus for data protection. And finally, I'll be closing off with some recommendations from my end, and this is purely from my experience, what I've seen work globally on when customers or internally within other organizations, when they look at mitigating risks in the cloud environment. So that's the high-level agenda. And moving on, this slide is mainly a key focus on what we've been seeing happening around the world. And if you see the dates, and these dates are not very old. If you see the no security discussion or no security related discussion is complete without actually understanding what are the kind of threats the world is facing and what are the risks the various companies are exposed to. And talking about cloud specifically, many of these headlines that you see here around data leakage or data breach activities, and they're all, many of these are due to misconfigured buckets on different cloud service providers, or human error when configuring these cloud environments. So various other reasons. So I'm not getting into the actual risks at the moment, but we cannot really have a deep, meaningful conversation around the risks and security risks and threats if we can't understand what are we facing into. And all these articles that I've called out are within the last month and a half. These are not very old. I'm not talking about 2010, 2011. This is purely 2019. If you see from February 2nd onwards to very recently until March 1st, there's heaps of incidents already. Data exposure, data breach, either through someone intentionally hacking these cloud environments, or due to human error, misconfiguring the cloud environment and leaving it exposed. Again, just want to draw your attention to the last line or the last heading, which is a very favorite question on Quora. All of you know what Quora is. So the question goes like, what are the most famous or biggest cloud security breaches, events / incidents? So it's very topical. The subject is very topical, and I've on purpose chosen that question because that's the biggest question on everyone's mind. That's the biggest challenge on everyone's mind. Every CIO, every CISO, every chief data officer or chief executive officer, whoever you name in the C-suite, everyone's biggest question is, how do we secure data? So that's the biggest question. So just a quick snapshot of biggest data breaches of the 21st century. There's by the billions and by the millions, the kind of accounts that have been compromised, and many of these breaches are due to human errors. And again, I'm not discounting human error here, but the reason I've brought this slide in here is because many of these environments are cloud-based environments, and some of these are private cloud, some of these are public cloud, some of these are hybrid cloud. So it's a mix and match of those. So we'll get to the details of what each of these are, but at a very high level, I wanted to put this out there, saying that data breaches are real, and given the cloud environment is supposed to be, taking us to a more safer place than our typical data centers, where we had outdated infrastructure or outdated network equipments which are susceptible to vulnerabilities. But the story so far is a bit different. Moving on. So in terms of stock taking, where we are at the moment, what does Gartner have to say? Gartner looks at the cloud environment and where the cloud market is going, especially the public cloud services. And they see a massive growth, even between 2018 to 2019. They're looking at projected growth of 17.3%, up to $206 billion from $176 billion in 2018. And the fastest growing segment, what they call as, is the IaaS, or the infrastructure as service. And they also say by 2022, 90% of the organizations will be looking at IaaS and PaaS, platform as a service. So it's a pretty big number that we're looking at. These numbers are staggering, and we see an upward trend of the cloud market. In terms of revenue, there are many key players in the market. We'll get to them very quickly, but if you see the revenue in billions of dollars, it's massive amount. It's just growing. If you see the horizontal line, which is the year, it's a massive. It's an upward curve, and of course, there's SaaS, which is already taken off quite early, and it's quite well established because the market has been favorable for SaaS, but there's also, we see an increasing trend moving upwards for IaaS as well. So a combination of IaaS, as Gartner called out in the previous, as I said in the previous slide, a combination of IaaS and PaaS will be the trend moving forward. So if we take that into consideration, this is going to be pretty critical, and securing cloud becomes all the more critical because what we have been doing traditionally on-premise data centers or co-located data centers, we have been putting security controls around it, trying to manage compliance and et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be much more important in the cloud environment, especially the public cloud environment. Moving on, just a quick spiel here on who the key players are in the cloud market. I don't want to be spending too much time here, but obviously the three big players in the leader section: AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google GCP. Other than that, in the lower left side quadrant, we have Alibaba, Oracle, and IBM as well. I don't want to spend too much time on this because our intention is not to look at these players in the cloud market, but to more focus more on the security and risks and threats and those kind of things. Especially the key players, what's happening in each of these key players in the public cloud adoption market. If you see the percentage of respondents that are running apps, and this is as per RightScale 2018 State of the Cloud report. So each of these key three top environments, majority of the people are running apps. That's what they're doing on these environments. And there's other small percentage of experimentation going on. They could be doing some kind of development activities, and another small percentage of they plan to use for other reasons. So that's how the market is trending at the moment. And this is where a big challenge is. You wear your security hat, and I'm sure most of you on this webinar, you're all mostly somehow related to security or the term security in some way. So if you wear your hats, you'll see that this is a space which is going to need a lot of attention going forward. So coming back to the obvious question, so what is cloud? Yeah, we've been talking about we've been using the word cloud. So what's cloud? So NIST Special Publication 800-145 defines it this way. I'm not going to read this whole thing out, but it's more about a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned and released within minimal management effort or service provider interaction. So it's that ability to scale up an environment quickly and to adapt to the changing delivery requirements of various organizations. So that's what, in general, we would look at cloud as. And there's essentially, there are 3 service models and 4 deployment models in the cloud space. So quickly jumping into that, the service model, we have the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And in the deployment model, we look at public, private, hybrid, and community. So these are the different models. And again, my intention is not to go too deep into these. So I'll quickly run through the next couple of slides. So you're welcome to do a bit more research on these. There's heaps of material available if you want to know more about how these models work and details about these. I'll quickly go through the fundamentals, and then we can move into our core focus area. So look into cloud models. We have software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service acts as like a fundamental building block, where you talk of building your storage and compute capabilities that's necessary for a cloud platform. And platform as a service is more on where you can create applications and build applications in that space. Software as a service is more where applications on demand. There are already applications running. You subscribe to these applications and you run off the cloud. So you're not responsible to manage the infrastructure, but you're more focused on working on the applications and subscribe more on a subscription-based model. That's how typically the software as a service works. According to NIST, the concept, the from a cloud conceptual reference model, there are some key players in the reference model, right from cloud provider, cloud broker, cloud auditor, cloud consumer, and then there is, of course, the cloud carrier. So each of these entities, there can be many of these entities which can be provided by a single entity, many of these services, or each of these services can be provided by different entities. So very quickly, cloud providers are the ones who provide your main cloud infrastructure platform. So they are your cloud providers. Typical examples like your AWS or Microsoft or Google. These are your cloud providers. Cloud brokers are your intermediary companies that actually work between the cloud consumer and the cloud provider, who help in configuring these cloud environments in either of these models, and who are also responsible to work closely with the provider and consumer. And cloud auditor, this is an independent entity which would probably be responsible to ensure compliance in the cloud environment. And an interesting part that I want to draw after I quickly touch upon cloud carrier is cloud carriers are mainly the entities that provide the necessary infrastructure bandwidth for enabling cloud. So the couple of areas I want to actually focus on in this reference model, the reason I pulled this up is it's nicely highlighted around security and privacy. If you look into the cloud provider, the gray box, the big gray box, you see two vertical lines, two vertical boxes, which are, one is around security, one is around privacy. So that basically, it stretches all the way from top to bottom. The reason is there's security and privacy overlays on each of these components within the cloud providers area, be it either service orchestration or cloud service management or resource abstraction, physical resource layer, any of these layers, within the cloud provider environment, security and privacy need to fit into those, into all of those areas. That means it needs to be interwoven into each of these layers within the cloud provider. And the other box I want to actually get your focus on is around cloud auditor. So cloud auditor is this independent entity that is expected to sit outside the cloud provider or the consumer or the broker or the carrier or any of these entities in order to provide assurance against compliance, against security and privacy requirements. So, and these cloud auditors can be independent entities, like your maybe big four auditing companies, for example, or it could be any other private organizations that are government entities that are responsible for auditing. So it's a very good way how NIST has represented where each of these players sit and what their responsibilities are. Just quickly moving on. Again, this is very specific to this slide. It talks a bit more around IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, the kind of services that are available to a cloud consumer at these various layers. And as we briefly touched upon when we were talking about the models earlier, the kind of services you will see a bit more in detail here. For example, SaaS has all these ERP, CRM, document management, email, financials, social networks. So a typical example is Office 365. It's a SaaS model, and Salesforce is a SaaS model. SAP ERP is a SaaS model. So there are thousands of examples like that. So I'm not delving into those details. So same with PaaS. Classic example is your Microsoft Azure platform that has its own inbuilt database and integration application deployment capabilities. And your IaaS is your example is your AWS, which falls under the infrastructure as a service kind of thing. So that's your classic services available to a consumer. If you plan to consume cloud, or if your organization you work for plans to consume cloud, so this is a great reference map. Moving on, so what are the activities that the cloud provider needs to be focusing on, when they provide services? So I'll focus on the two key areas, which is security and privacy. That's more important for our conversation today, other than the service deployment, service orchestration, cloud services management. So we'll go a bit deeper into those as we speak now. So and this is a very interesting diagram that I found should be applicable to our conversation today. So if you look at the cloud consumer and cloud provider, they're kind of inversely proportional. If you're a cloud provider, your responsibilities stretch across the layers, the operating system, middleware, and the application layer. Whereas if you're a cloud consumer, for SaaS, you're only concerned about the application layer. You don't worry about the underlying middleware or the operating system. So similarly with PaaS, it is somewhat, it meets in the middle. But with IaaS, again, as a consumer, you have more responsibility because you need to have more governance controls. You need to be across the threats, the risks, and the attack vectors that you need to be conscious about if you subscribe to an IaaS model. Whereas if you're a cloud provider, if you're providing IaaS services, then all you need to worry about is ensure that fundamental controls around operating system layer are good, and the rest of it will be managed by the consumer. So this is the reason I've called out this specifically, is because there's a lot of confusion in the market around, we have subscribed to an IaaS like Amazon, like AWS, and so they're going to take care of everything. We don't need to do anything now, but it depends on what have you subscribed them for. Is it IaaS? Then you have more responsibility. And if you have gone down the path of Salesforce, probably for your CRM solution, then obviously you don't need to worry about the underlying platform's risks and threats. Like for example, patch management. You don't need to worry about the platform patch management because that's a responsibility of Salesforce to take care of those things. So this is something which is really important if you're a security person, to understand its cloud consumer and cloud provider, how it's inversely linked, especially around when it comes to the control. What control do you have on the cloud environment? So that's a bit of a quick look at responsibilities wise. So jumping into our core focus area, I know I've spent probably 15 minutes or so talking about cloud security, talking about cloud itself before getting into cloud security, but it was important to kind of get the basics right and understand the overall the lay of the landscape. How does the cloud environment look like, and from a security point, what are we more interested in? And now it makes more sense for us to go into security now that we have an understanding of what the cloud environment is and how is it structured, and what is the, at a high level, we have seen the reference model, and we have also seen in our previous slides the responsibilities on the cloud service provider and the cloud consumer. So moving on from a cloud security, and I'm going with the stock standard definition, which anyone can find on the net. It's more about a set of policies, technologies, applications, and controls that are utilized to protect. I've highlighted that word protect there, data application services and infrastructure. So that's basically what cloud security is all about. It's no different from our typical security that we would put around if there is a data center. If the data applications or services are hosted in a data center, we would probably be looking at the same things, policies, technologies, applications, and controls. It's no different. Again, there's a lot of memes out there on the internet on what cloud is. Cloud is someone else's computer. I saw this funny meme the other day where it says cloud is someone else's computer. It's no different. So similarly, the security around cloud shouldn't be very different when it is someone else's computer. So, so we need policies, technologies, applications, and controls to protect the data application services. So in effect, it's still part of information security. It's no different from we are not stepping away from the boundary of information security. We are still in that, and we are still going to be talking within those parameters. Moving on, when we talk of cloud, the biggest question which comes from the management is, what are the challenges to move to cloud? I would rather I'll delve into the security challenges, but I want to very briefly call out, along with saying security is one of the key challenges, there is other areas like cloud interoperability issues and service level agreements, hosting model or the charging model, what is used. So the key one for us is the first point, which I've highlighted, which is security. And the other four, I'm going to leave out of this conversation because we're not talking about cloud in general, but more around security in the cloud environment. So getting into the topic of what are the common threats and attacks that we normally see within a cloud environment. Again, this is not specific to a particular service provider. And I've tried to keep this presentation very vendor neutral. This has got nothing to do with a specific vendor, or I'm not trying to highlight weaknesses in any vendor. This is I've kept it at a very high level so that there's some takeaway for all of us, and it can be applied to any of the vendors. So just bear that in mind. So the kind of if you look at attacks itself, we can broadly classify attacks into application attacks and network attacks. So from an application attacks, what we see in a cloud environment is, where cloud malware injection attack, cookie poisoning, backdoor and debug option, hidden field manipulation, guest hopping attack, SQL injection, side channel attack. Again, these are no different from what we normally see if you host your applications in your own data center or in a co-located data center. That the kind of application attacks you would normally see in that environment is similar to a cloud environment. So it shouldn't be very different if you ask me, because as I said a little while ago, cloud is just someone else's computer, or set of computers, thousands of computers put together that way. So you shouldn't see too much of difference in terms of application attacks. Again, these, I'm pretty sure if you are from a security background, you kind of understand what these attacks are and why these are really dangerous for the cloud environment if applications in the cloud environment are not configured properly, or if they have not been programmed properly, or if security has not been considered when the development of an application is happening. Then some or most of these attacks are possible, and which we as security professionals understand these terminologies. Moving on with network attacks, again, no different from your normal network attacks that you would see if you have hosted data in a data center. So man-in-the-middle attack, or cross-site scripting, network sniffing, DOS attacks, so the domain hijacking. So these are all various network attacks which are pretty common if the cloud environment is not configured properly, if the environment is not secure enough, if there are gaps in the environment, then these attacks can be initiated by a malicious actor who can potentially get on your network or on the service provider's network and potentially be able to compromise the data that is owned by you or your company. So I'm going to stop at this because each of these we can talk for an hour on each of these. Man-in-the-middle attack or network sniffing or DOS attacks. We can talk for an hour, on each of these topics, but that's not the intention of today's presentation. So I'll leave it at this, but I would want to get into the threats, and this is a place where I want to spend some time because these threats can lead to risks, and that's why I want to spend a bit of time on this top security threats for the cloud environment. So we do have things like unauthorized use of cloud computing. So unauthorized usage is always a challenge when it comes to cloud computing. And again, in the upcoming slides, I will go down and provide some recommendations on the kind of controls that we should be looking at, looking for each of these threats. So the next threat is around data loss or data leakage, account or service hijacking, insecure interfaces between providers and APIs, third-party issues, unknown risk profile between cloud operators, and malicious insider threats. So these are some of the high-level threats I've called out as part of my session today. So of course we can map out a few more. I'm pretty sure there are people on the line here who have worked on various cloud environments, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to knock off a few more of the threats. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is more about being able to give a bit of high-level understanding or high-level overview on what are the kind of top security threats that we are seeing in the cloud environment. So moving on, so in the previous slide we saw, we called out a few high-level threats, and specific to those threats, I've called out some mitigation here, unauthorized use of cloud computing. So how can that be mitigated? By bringing in stricter access control process. We all know that access control forms the fundamental or the basic control for any environment, irrespective of cloud or non-cloud. Access control forms the basic control, and if someone can breach access management or access management controls, then they are within the environment, and then it's up to the other controls which are within the environment to then identify and then stop any kind of attacks. But access control will form one of the basic fundamental controls. Within the cloud environment, a stronger registration and validation process is a good thing to have, and a comprehensive introspection of customer network traffic. And this is more around the monitoring aspect of it when we talk of introspection of customer network traffic. So you want to know if someone is in the network, you need to be able to introspect the traffic, if there is any unauthorized activity or any unauthorized person, unknown IPs, or there's some kind of a pattern. I'm not going to go into the tools that we need to use. That's again a different topic by itself. So these are some of the key mitigation controls that we need to be looking at, and to minimize the threat of unauthorized use of cloud computing. As far as data loss and leakage is concerned, ensure that you're encrypting the data in storage and in transit, because if someone does get into your network, if your data is encrypted in storage, that means you are definitely safer, and also encrypt the data in transit, because if there's a man-in-the-middle attack, or if there's network sniffing kind of an attack, you're still protected because your data is encrypted. And it would be difficult for someone to actually decrypt it on the go, or to be able to break it immediately. Ensure there's data protection at both design and runtimes, and this is around ensuring application security. So if you bring in data protection controls at both design and runtime, you are definitely better off. And so in privacy terms, from a GDPR point, there's something called as privacy by design. And that privacy by design is basically to ensure data protection at both design and runtime. So that's one of the tenets of privacy by design. Ensure strong key management practices, including key creation, storage, disposal, all of them as part of the process, key management process. Ensure that that is pretty strong, and ensure you have a strong data disposal methodology. Now, there's obviously a lot of there's a lot of ways in which you can dispose data securely, and some of them, like and some of the regulations around the world mandate for proper data disposal, including GDPR for that matter, from a privacy point, just to make sure that you minimize the risk of data loss or unintended data leakage. And moving on, account or service hijacking. Again, access management controls plays a big role. Two-factor authentication techniques, use them where it's possible, because yes, two-factor is not always, it's not 100% safe. Two-factor is not 100% safe, but nevertheless, two-factor does provide you some level of assurance than a single-factor authentication. So go for two-factor where possible. Ensure there is logging and monitoring of unauthorized activities, again, so that you're able to track if there's some kind of account or service hijacking that's taken place. And this is very critical, even when it comes to if there is a potential data breach and there is forensics that needs to be carried out within the environment, then logging and monitoring of unauthorized activities becomes a key evidence. And yes, there are ways in which a malicious actor may try to evade being logged and monitored, but nevertheless, again, I'm not going to go into those aspects of hacking and stuff, but this is more around the need to log and monitor. There's also a requirement from various regulators and various legislations that have been passed around data security, data privacy, that we need to monitor and log and monitor all critical data and all activities within the environment. So that's one of the reasons. And I understand the cloud service provider security policies and SLAs. So this is critical because by default, I think you remember a couple of slides ago, I showed you that the inversely proportional responsibilities between the cloud provider and the consumer. So if you're consuming IaaS, infrastructure as a service, then your responsibility is much higher when it comes to security policies, ensuring that assurance within the cloud environment is your responsibility. And while the service provider might extend their available security capability to cover certain aspects of security requirements, but it still would be your responsibility to ensure appropriate security policies are in place in the cloud environment. And also the SLAs, because they'll define how the response will be provided by in case of any account or service hijacking does take place. How would the service provider, the cloud service provider, around what time, and all the turnaround time and all those things, when they'll provide the service, how soon will they provide their service or support, all that is defined in the SLA. So please make sure those things are well defined. Insecure interfaces between service providers. Mitigation wise, you need to understand the security model of cloud provider, the cloud provider interfaces, how their security models are, because when you're talking about hybrid cloud and not just a single provider, but you might be looking at multiple providers for all the business needs, or you might be looking at a hybrid option of in-house, that is on-premise, and cloud model kind of thing. So you'll need to do a bit of mix and match there, to understand what is your security requirement, your organization security requirement, and how does the cloud provider provide assurance. So you need to understand their security model first of all. And if you are a security manager, you are or a risk manager, you'll be required to understand that and call out any call out any unwanted risks that you would see within the cloud provider's security model. You will be required to document that and present to your management so they know what they're signing off against before they sign on the dotted line. Again, to reduce insecure, to have control over insecure interfaces, strong authentication access controls are again recommended to ensure transmission between source and destination is secure. Again, similar to my previous slide around data protection, where I said encrypt data in motion or in transit. So ensure that you use TLS 1.2 or above, and from where we stand today, even I think 1.2 is either compromised or close to being compromised. So, but make sure that you use secure transmission mechanisms. Understand what dependency you have with the various APIs, because if you're using third-party APIs, understand the dependency chain with that. You know, if the third party goes bankrupt and if that third party is no longer available to provide that API, then your business should not be left left in the lurch. Or if the third party who's providing the API, if that gets compromised, then you run a risk of running a compromised API, which if you're not aware of, the third party from who's provided you the API, if they are not aware that their API has been compromised, that means in effect everyone's running blind at that moment. The third party and your company that's taken the service of the third party, everyone's running blind because someone's already broken into that API and they're already either sniffing the traffic that goes to the API, or they have already manipulated so that copies of data that is that uses that API is already sent off to another location for storage. So these are all some of the risks. So moving on third-party issues, this is mainly critical because in many instances, organizations would take assistance of third parties to run their cloud environment, in which case you're not necessarily having a day-to-day view of all the risks or the threats within that environment. It's the third-party organization's responsibility. That means you need to have very good SLAs with that, a very strong contract, first of all. The legal and the procurement team should have done a great job in order to have a foolproof contract, because in case of any compromise, you should be able to pull the plug and then be able to run the service yourself. That's one of the things. Other than that, make sure there's proper assessment done of the third party before they are signed on. You've got to monitor the environment for any unauthorized changes or activity that can potentially be happening with the third parties. Again, authentication access control for privileged access is really critical. If you do not have a view of how privileged access is being used, who's got privileged access, then that becomes a massive risk. You'll have to enforce SLAs for patching, SLAs for vulnerability management, identification of vulnerabilities and remediation of those vulnerabilities to be on top of the third parties, because their drive to keep your data secure is only as strong as the contract. If the contract is not strong enough, or if they're not being paid enough to protect your data, then they don't really have a drive to put in that extra effort to identify vulnerabilities regularly and remediate any gaps that are found in the environment. So please be on top of it. Then ensure you conduct pen testing and operational audits of the third parties. If the third party environment is compromised and if they have a flat network, a horizontal network, then it's very easy for anyone in their environment to get to your part of the area within the third party where they manage your environment. It's easy for them to escalate privileges and get across the network pretty quickly. So make sure it's about having control over the third parties. That's what it is, and just make sure that you're doing everything that's needed to keep the third parties in check. The last two of the threats that I want to focus on. Unknown risk profile between cloud operators. Again, this is with regard to if you're looking at hybrid cloud, where you're working with multiple cloud providers and your data is spread across multiple cloud providers, then you'll definitely need to be on top of what is the risk profile of each of these cloud providers, because yes, from a day-to-day operations wise, the cloud provider is responsible for managing their environment. If it is platform as a service, for example, they're responsible at least till the middle tier to be able to manage vulnerabilities or manage threats in the environment. But you'll need to be across what does the risk profile look like, who gets those reports, what kind of reports do they generate, and etc., etc. So you'll need to be on top of it. Ensure you get access to the logs and data, and you're able to analyze those logs, especially the environment where your data is stored or being processed. Ensure there's full disclosure of vulnerabilities in the service provider environment. So they need to be carrying out regular vulnerability assessments or vulnerability scanning and mapping where the gaps are, and you should have a visibility of that. And you need to also have monitoring, alerting solutions for critical data in the cloud. So especially in that, when your data is spread between multiple cloud operators or service providers, you'll need to have proper understanding of where your critical data is. Not all data is critical, as you understand, but at least you should know where that critical data is, and you'll need to at least monitor and need to have monitoring and alerting solutions. The last of the threat mitigation I want to focus on is around malicious insider threats. Again, insider threats is mostly or most of the time related to people. So one of the key things is you'll need to have proper control over employment contracts. Like you're able to bind down employees who have access to critical data. And for that, you'll need to work with the human resources department within your organization to, along with of course IT or your information security, wherever you sit in your organization chain, with the management of that head of, or whoever is your lead, you'll need to work with them to work with human resource requirements to make sure that the employment contracts have proper checks and balances in them. And things like background checks are really critical if you're provisioning access to people to work on, let's say, financial data for that matter, or personally identifiable information or sensitive information. So that becomes very critical. And ensure that there is transparency in the overall management practices and in compliance reporting. So that will reduce insider threats, that will reduce collusion, basically, two or more people getting together to compromise an organization or compromise the data within an organization. And last but not the least, to mitigate insider threats, ensure that you have established a very good data breach notification process, because it's not just about preventing stuff happens, things go wrong. There'll always be someone who's not happy with an organization, the policies of an organization, or someone who feels they're not being paid enough, for whatever the reason might be. They may have different motivation, so they may end up creating some kind of trouble within the network. So which means you'll need to have a proper data breach notification process whereby the management is able to take the right actions and notify the right people at the right time, so that in further damage can be controlled and the right actions can be done as far as your federal government or your central government or any of the federal agencies within your countries, as per the requirement, the management is able to do the right thing and initiate the right actions if and when stuff does happen. So that's from a threat mitigation point, and I quickly want to go through security controls that we normally see on premise. If you're having your data on premise, then what are the kind of security controls that you see? There's a reason I've called this out, is because you can have similar controls in the cloud environment. I have stopped short of calling out specific vendor specific or the cloud service provider specific controls, because each of the cloud provider, if you understand what on-premise security controls that you normally would look for when you have to protect critical data, then you can, if you talk to a cloud provider, they'll be able to provide you what is the equivalent of these on-premise security controls in their environment. That is definitely available, and I know I work with all the main cloud providers that we spoke about in the beginning of the presentation. So I know each of the service provider has their own version of these on-premise security controls. I'm not going to read these one by one. You know exactly what is listed out here. Things like DLPs, data loss prevention, and firewall IDS, IPS, log analysis, SIEM, key management, which is critical, identity access management, user access management, privileged access management. I've clubbed all of them under one because it's all around access management. So each of the service provider, cloud service provider, has something around parallel controls to each of these, what I have listed here. It's pretty exhaustive with each of the service providers. So if you look at the top 3 service providers, AWS, Azure, and Google, it doesn't mean that IBM or Alibaba don't have these. They do have their own version of each of these on-premise security controls. So you just need to work with your service provider around these. What are these parallel controls within their environment? What do they call these controls? They may have a different name for these, but make sure that you speak to your cloud service provider who you are dealing with around specific controls around these within their environments. So that's from the security controls that you need to be focusing on. Quickly moving on, the last part of this presentation is around recommendations. The foremost important thing is, please consider stakeholder or business requirements prior to any decision to move to the cloud, because without business buy-in, I know there was a lot of shadow IT and shadow business in many of the organizations, trying a larger organization. So make sure that those things are covered. Ensure enterprise architecture framework, the framework that the enterprise architects in an organization have developed, supports either IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS model. If their architecture talks about SaaS and and if the IT solutions or the solution design team is looking at IaaS, then it's completely difference between heaven and earth. So there's no way that they're going to meet at any point. So those need to be considered properly, because then your security controls is different for each of these models. So you'll need to be across at an enterprise architecture level as well, to be able to talk to them to understand where what their framework talks about, or where they are going with their architecture design and things like that. Consider all data protection requirements. GDPR is just the beginning. There's more There are more regulations, data privacy regulations on the way around the world, including US. Again, here in Australia, there's been a bunch in Southeast Asia. So will be in the Middle East. So just make sure your data protection requirements, you capture all the data protection requirements. Make sure, make sure you've done due diligence of the cloud service provider. Consider all the third-party risks which we spoke about earlier. One of the very important things, carry out data classification activities before migrating data to the cloud. Because if you don't know what your critical data is, and if the architects haven't figured out where they will be storing critical data, then as a security person, you'll be called in the end, which happens in most of the cases, to remediate the bad decisions that have been done by not you, but someone else who would have not thought of data classification as an activity which has to be done before deciding where critical data has to be moved within the cloud, or what are the kind of controls that are needed. Involve legal and procurement before signing up. Agree SLAs around performance and availability. Plan for data migration only after you consider all the security requirements. Again, security is an afterthought in many organizations, and because of this, all the remediation activities go on for many years and years, because security has not been thought through in the beginning, and that's a massive issue. So make sure that those things have been captured. Validate all compliance requirements are met, and last but not the least, train IT staff and increase security awareness if required, because the cloud environment is a little different. So obviously, people do not have enough knowledge on how that environment is architected. Then again, the issue is around lack of knowledge, which can lead to human error. So that's the biggest challenge. And that's it from my end. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, wherever you are around the world. And if you are probably in the Southern Hemisphere, it's already past 5 o'clock, past the go home time. And thanks for your time today. And I welcome any questions from your end. Thank you.